circulating. It's out there. And frankly, it will behoove us to conduct our own investigation and be out there with conclusions ahead of them. We've got to view it in that context.
Well, Mr. Horton, as long as you're on that context, I take note of your comment that there are United States individuals connected with some of these companies like Red Star and Minos. So tell me a little bit about that, why we should be cautious of that, and what you know so far.
Well, again, I viewed this from a perspective of traditional analysis of the FCPA as it will be applied in a commercial setting. And I said, you know, if we view this as a commercial contract,
FCPA being the
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and one thing that prosecutors do applying this is they look to these sorts of contract and subcontracting relationships and test, is there really an arm's length relationship between the original company and the first tier contractor? And applying those tests, we come to a conclusion very quickly: there is no such arm's length relationship. And that's using the traditional factors: who are the officers, who are the people who are working in the company, what's its tradition, what's its business history, has it operated in this sort of business in the past, what volume of business does it have before, how are the contracts concluded, was there open bidding for it, how are competitors. You apply all these tests and it flunks every single test, which means using the traditional Department of Justice analysis, not arm's length.
Thank you. Ambassador, what do you say about the Akayev regime when it was in power? Do you believe that it was corrupt as well as the Bakayev? Do you take no position on that, or what information do you want to share?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to say, first of all, about the previous question as well. I think that such a type of investigation will be quite important for the fellow democracy, emerging democracy, to learn lessons from the leading democracy in the world. How some of the problems, peculiarities, has to be resolved in a legal framework, and it will be really great. First. And secondly, about the corrupted practices, I think this is an issue where we have to now again admit that during the Akayev's regime, when I was an ambassador, in 2003, I was at the Gene Haskell's University, and I was grilled on the same issue 7 years ago. And I admitted that probably yes, because President's family is involved in that business. But guys, how we have to regulate it? What kind of legislations and framework we to do? Because it is an issue where our country has to admit and then further to resolve it. And probably this investigation will help for us to not to allow for the rulers to do something which people view as against their their benefits and for their wealth. But secondly, also, it would help for us to understand what are the reasons that the base now changed its status from being the strategically important in order to protect them from the external threat, and had become a source of such a controversy. Because we have another example in Kyrgyzstan of the famous company Komtor, gold mining. It experienced same kind of problems during 2 or 3 years. And we have just a couple of such a projects. Why we are in such a bottleneck when people now view the US base just as source of the money? And it's quite an important question, which I think this investigation also would help to resolve.
Well, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, could I speak to the comparison of President Akayev and Bakiyev on this point?
So, there being no objection, sure, go right ahead.
It's true that both were corrupt, both regimes were corrupt, but the degree of corruption in the most recent regime of Bakiyev was far greater, bringing his son right into the central core of the executive branch. The other difference, however, didn't have to do with corruption, but it had to do with the level of repression. In Akayev, it was still possible to have a relatively vibrant civil society. That was being destroyed since 2007. We had a criminalization of the state in Kyrgyzstan where law enforcement authorities were intermingled with criminal groups, where the former chief of staff of the president was incinerated in his car because he dared to flirt with the opposition, We had journalists and opposition politicians being killed, members of the parliament being killed. This kind of thing didn't happen under Akayev. So I think there was a qualitative difference between the Akayev and the Bakiyev eras.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Mr. Flake, you're recognized.
We've spoken about the air base, and Dr. Cooley, the air base being used politically, and Dr. Husky. If you could elaborate, how will this be used in a political campaign? Is there popular support in the population for the air base? Does the population simply want the revenue to trickle down a little more freely, or what kind of politics are going to be used with the air base? If you could elaborate that.
Again, as I was suggesting, the air base has to be seen as a part of a decade-long history of Kyrgyzstan either selling or auctioning its territory. It began at the end of the 1990s with the Chinese border delimitation, where Kyrgyzstan lost 250,000 acres to China. There are lots of rumors about the president at the time taking money and other members of the cabinet. Kazakhstan was given territory. Uzbekistan was on the verge of getting a very sweet deal. So unfortunately, now Manas is a part of that tradition, and I don't think we could say that in the Kyrgyz population the base is terribly popular. They've, I think, forgotten what happened in 2001. It's almost a decade beyond that point, and as Ambassador Abdurisayev was saying, the incursion of people from Afghanistan through southwestern Kyrgyzstan at the end of the 1990s, which alarmed the population and the government large. But now I think it is not a terribly popular idea. The only thing I would say is that it is possible that some of the parties that are now separate will come together before the election. If they do, one could imagine a moderate stance on this, an accommodationist stance. The danger would be that that kind of fused party would be outflanked by a party willing to, again, hit the piñata, as Professor Cooley says, with the air base issue.
Dr. Cooley, and then, sure.
The base will certainly be an issue in the campaign, but it's not going to be the only issue, and I would argue it wouldn't be the prime issue. What drove the events of the last 2 weeks were anger about, as was stated, the increase in electricity and gas tariffs, which is a result of corruption, and the accelerating pace of corruption, which has been pointed out, that in the Bakiyev government, the level of corruption, the depth of corruption intensified tremendously. Really, by focusing on corruption and coming up with concrete ways of being more transparent in the way in which funds are provided for rent and other aspects of the base, the United States can best represent itself and put the base issue to rest and address the focus on the real issue in Kyrgyzstan, which is corruption and its effect on government, which is entirely corrosive.
Did you have something to add there?
Yeah, just very quickly. The base faces a very negative media environment, and always has done in Kyrgyzstan from the Russian language press. And a lot of the stories that they run are untrue. They're rumors. They're meant to delegitimize it, accuse the base of doing all sorts of things that they're not doing. So the media terrain is very difficult. And issues like this just keep stacking up on top. Now, the Transit Center does have a website now. It's much more proactive than it was a year ago, and I would commend the base for taking some good PR steps. But a lot of the images in the Kyrgyz mind about the base have been set. I think our best case scenario, a pro-base politician, if we want to use that word, I think will only be able to run on the promise that they will keep the base but renegotiate some of its legal provisions. I think that's the political space. I think the sort of time for business as usual, no one's going to get behind that.
Right. Mr. Ambassador, first I'm glad to see you're at UVU. My kids are at BYU next door.
Oh.
So, but I'm wondering, there was as much as $8 million a month, it was thought, that might have been skimmed off these oil contracts, fuel contracts. Is there any effort, or was this money seized somewhere in these campaigns that will come out? Or politicians claiming that they can recoup some of this money? And is that a way that that they can, through transparency and whatnot, legitimize the existence of the base at least? Is there an effort to seize the money that has been skimmed? Or is that money just gone now?
I think it requires a serious investigation, and from the Kyrgyz side and the U.S. side as well. But first of all, the hearings and transparency in this process, I think, would help us to maybe to recover part of that money. But the difference with the previous regime that now people, they would at least already know that how that money would be spent, not only but now current ones for a couple of more years. And I think there is no fear that with the new people there will be such again problems like before, because now we have a plurality, so many people on the basis of again of difference of opinions, they will elaborate some decision which benefit society in a more positive way than the previous regime. Previous regime, everything was so clouded and made in secret, and therefore, as a result, it caused such a problems. But now, I think it's worth to do it. And by the way, my guess is that if you would do that, we would ask also the economic conditions and question the presence of another base. Which exists now also Russian one. And by the way, when we signed the agreement with both United States and Russia in 2001, the reasons were the same. And it's quite important for us to see how, in this case, society would benefit politically, strategically, economically from both cases. So don't be afraid.
Thank you. Time. Go ahead.
They're trying to trace that money and freeze it right now. So there is an ongoing effort to specifically identify the counterparties and freeze and secure the funds, just to hold it while they then deal with the question of liability and whether it can be recovered.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Driehaus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Dr. Husky, you had talked about the actions of the U.S. Embassy and our treatment of opposition leaders leading up to the change in government. And I'm curious as to your opinion as to whether or not structurally at the embassy folks have recognized the failure of their actions and what we have done to address that, or are the same people in place? We talk a lot about this investigation and looking at the air base, but I'm wondering if we're also looking internally at the decision-making process at the embassy and whether or not we've learned anything from that and are outwardly expressing signs that, yes, we recognize what we failed to do and we are adjusting for that.
Last week I spoke to people in the State Department and the administration. I think there is a recognition that changes have to be made in the embassy. There was the previous ambassador who left, it would have been right about when I arrived in July of 2008, had a fairly active agenda with opposition members. And the new ambassador, Ambassador Gefeller, adopted a very different policy. I understand, again, simply from second-hand accounts that there was some disagreement with that policy in the embassy itself, and I'm afraid you'll have to go elsewhere to find more detail about this. But obviously, an ambassador would not, it seems to me, on her own be able to make such an important decision as to stand aside from the opposition and the democratic change-oriented forces in a country. That would have had to have been something known and approved in Washington.
So it's your understanding that the policies that were being pursued were being instructed, or driven by the State Department in Washington, not necessarily driven by the ambassador?
I would so assume.
Have there been outward signs at the embassy to the government? I mean, there's been mention of, the way in which we could help fund education, how we could pay for the elections. We talk about the path forward, as Mr. Horton suggested. The investigation is important, but are there other things that the embassy could be doing to show that we've learned our lessons, to show that, in fact, we are working cooperatively with the government, we are rooting out some of the corruption that has been identified, and we are on a new path? Have there been outward signs to that effect from the embassy?
The embassy has certainly been talking to the interim government and very actively. It's probably early days to re-engage with NGOs, but I would assume they would do that, and they would do that again very actively. There are a number of projects that the United States probably ought to get involved in that region, some of them infrastructural projects that would assist them in hydroelectric production. Russia has gotten involved in a very big way with a kind of demonstration project, a huge-scale project that's now somewhat uncertain as to when it's going to be finished. But there are a lot of small-scale hydroelectric things that we could do in the United States that I think would bring terrific economic and political benefits to both sides.
Mr. Ambassador?
I would like just to add maybe the view of the outsider, because 5 years I was out of the decision-making in Bishkek and also dealing with the U.S. Embassy. I think that it would be difficult to blame just the ambassador in such changes in the policy. And my guess that here the opinion of Scott is quite important. That the United States probably already decided not to treat our country as a fellow democracy, but just a regular case of the corrupted and failed state. And we could see so many opinions, not only among the State Department people, but also among the community of experts. In 2005, I was surprised by the fact that President Nazarbayev used the case of the Kyrgyzstan as a mocking in order to be re-elected for the next time. And it was surprising that neither U.S. or experts in the West, they just looked at that case as something which is indifferent for them. Our country was used as a case of the, violent one and failed one. And, here we already started to lose its connections based on the respect to the values and shared values as well. And Bakiyev, we have to also take into account, he did all of the efforts in order to cut ties with the United States. He never ever expressed his desire to come to Washington, D.C. During his case, 4 diplomats were expelled from Kyrgyzstan. It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable to expel for almost nothing. And I can understand that the ambassador, when she came to her new position, there was already a whole trend. Now it is necessary to change, again, to restore our, attention based on the multi-dimensional cooperation, where educational, then people's diplomacy exchanges and other things could restore that credibility and will be a different attitude.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Turner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patton, you mentioned that perhaps they weren't hearing the word democracy enough from us, so my question is about democracy. I would like each of you, if you would, to give us your thoughts on what are the what's the transition look like? Is it possible for them to transition to democracy, and what can we do to help?
Of all the
and I'm sorry, Mr. Patton, before you begin, because I have a feeling that may take up most of my time for you to each give your thoughts on democracy, I want to ask unanimous consent from the chairman. I have an article that's regardless of who's in power, we have an ally in need, by Eric Stewart, former U.S. Department of Commerce Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia, which just sounds many of the themes that I know you're going to be telling us.
Without objection, that will be put on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patton.
Mr. Patton.
Thank you, Congressman. Kyrgyzstan has for some time been seen among all the Central Asian states as the most pluralistic, with the most opportunities for citizen participation, and certainly during the Akayev period that was seen to a far greater extent than in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or obviously Turkmenistan. The repressions increased over the Bakiyev term, but there is an experience in Kyrgyzstan of civic entitlement that does not exist elsewhere in Central Asia. And for that reason, there is an opportunity, particularly in this next 6 months, in the 3 months leading up to the constitutional referendum, and then in the fall elections. The key issue is really going to be the legitimacy of the interim government. This is an unelected government, whereas Bakiyev was elected, albeit by a rigged election. So the best way that they can approach that from the standpoint of democracy is to engage civil society, which is reasonably strong in Kyrgyzstan relative to other Central Asian countries. There is an independent public council of strong civil society groups that's played a very constructive role in the last 2 weeks. They've engaged in an effort to try and ease tensions between Bakiyev before he left the country and the interim government, and they've offered draft legislation already to be considered in issues such as freedom of the media and reform of police and law enforcement. So encouraging and supporting civil society is probably the best thing we can do in the next 3 to 6 months.
Well, I agree with Sam Patton on every single point he made. They're exactly right, up and down the list. And I think acting decisively, vocally, and with funds to support these elections, to support the Constitution process is extremely important. Enabling civil society, ensuring that it plays a vibrant role, as I'm sure it can in this process, is critical. And I think Kyrgyzstan is a standout in this entire region. It's a country where there are, in fact, millions of people who deeply care about democracy and civil liberties. They're willing to take to the streets for it, to stand up and die for it. They've overturned 2 governments over this. It's a unique opportunity, and it's something that forms the basis for a bond with the United States that can be lasting and that can serve our mutual security interests.
Yes, I would just underscore that I think the focus should be on encouraging political pluralism, be it in media or civil society. Yes, the technical stuff is important in terms of democracy, but it's really creating spaces for the rich political pluralism and diversity of sort of viewpoints and, external affiliations that the Kyrgyz have. I think that should be the focus.
I would like also to mention here, as an addition, that now it's time to work with the political parties. And during my, couple of years, last time interaction with opposition, I could see a couple of really great hopes with several parties. So that's why if we would embolden them, help them, especially not only with creating the party structures, but also some of the bodies which help them to develop programs, analytical research, etc. And they will quite quickly adjust to that. Will develop quite a sound and long-lasting programs and would be impact. One of such parties, I would say, Atamikin, with Tekibayev. I was impressed. He's the person who, during that 2 years, was trying to push that process of engaging with the people on using his grassroots level support, and there are quite an impressive developments.
Just quickly, I think we've heard about 2 preconditions that are in place for democracy. One is culture, and one is leadership, with Tekibayev, Ambassador just mentioned, Atumbayeva, Sariev, but I think the other issue is institutions and what kinds of rules are going to be established in the constitution drafting. It's my feeling that a parliamentary republic for Kyrgyzstan will be preferable. It will prevent the concentration of power. It will be less likely that we'll have a winner-take-all type election with a presidency. And we see already in the draft that Mr. Tekibayev has put forward, he has the idea of the legitimacy of the opposition, which we take for granted in this country, but which we only developed in the early 19th century in the United States. And Kyrgyzstan and many other countries in the world are trying to do that. He's trying to institutionalize this by actually giving the opposition the chairmanships of the two key committees in the next parliament. That would be the budget committees and the defense committees. Frankly, I'm not sure that would work. But at least there's the idea of creating institutions that are going to prevent a concentration of power.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. You can pretty much bet that wouldn't be working around here. Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I really appreciate your testimony, but I want to ask the question about what appears to me to be an irresolvable conflict. Get your thoughts on that. On the one hand, the necessity for the American military is to have a secure supply line, and that obviously is to protect our troops. And that need is coming and that need suggests, to accomplish it, a partner that they can deal with, corrupt or not. And that urgency of supplying our troops is going to take precedence, I would think, over any other goals. What you have been describing are, in effect, pro-democracy goals that I certainly support. But in the real world, particularly with the pressure that is on our troops, is going to be considered a luxury. So how do you do both, or do we have to face the fact that we can't do both? I'll start with you, Dr. Husky.
It is going to be very difficult to do both, but the reality is that if they elect a government that isn't willing to extend the air base, please, there's not much we can do about it except offer a lot more money. And I think money will speak in a country that has a very small GDP, struggling budget, economic crisis. I think there are ways, therefore, that even if we have a very negative outcome in the fall, that we may be able to counterbalance that. But I think it is going to be a very heavy price we would have to pay.
Ambassador? Thank you.
Thank you much for asking such a question. I think now we have more hopes with this second upheaval that society and political structures which we are creating would be more receptive to the variety of the opinions. And I think that no need here to be afraid that if a ruling party will make such a decision. Now we'll have more voices in order to oppose. And you could see that, for example, I have an opinion that this is a base which has a strategically important meaning for the Kyrgyz Republic. I know several opposition leaders, hardliners, who are saying base is necessary to keep there. Why? Because, you know, we already sacrificed 55 lives, and situation in Afghanistan is worse than it was in 1999. Therefore, you know, it is something where will be no decision like Bakiyev, money in pocket, and that's it.
Let me keep going. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Yeah.
Dr. Cooley.
No, I mean, I think this is the dilemma. I would make 2 points. One is because of the different things that the base meant to us and to the Kyrgyz, I think threats that the Kyrgyz somehow evict the U.S. Were not credible. In other words, I think we had considerable more leeway for maneuver on the political issues than we thought at the time, number one. Number two, planning for political change, especially in an important overseas base host, that has to be part of the strategic planning effort. Hedging our bets, reaching out to potential future political leaders. It's not an all or nothing proposition, because we have a lot of historical cases here. The Philippines, we didn't manage the opposition well there. Thailand, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Okinawa, even the backlash in Korea that you see. All of these have to do with sort of, you know, democratizing forces, you know, coming in and re-examining basing relationships because somehow they were linked to sort of the past. So I would make that strategic planning part of the way how we think about the base in an everyday sense.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Horton.
I would say I think we have to start by recognizing there will be situations where imperative concerns of national security will justify a departure from normal procurement rules. I'll put it, you know, mildly. But I'm not sure. In fact, I believe that Kyrgyzstan was not such a case, and where the appropriate effort to do it the right way needed to be made and wasn't made. And I think there's also another really fundamental point that I think Alex just made. I'll put it in slightly different terms. It's a question of whether we're focused on a short-term or a long-term relationship. If it's a short-term, well, you know, corners will be cut and we don't care. If we want to have a long-term relationship with this country, we want to have a facility there for the long term, and that's a politically very hot issue, of course, then we have to modulate our behavior accordingly. And we have to respect them and show respect for their institutions, their aspirations for rule of law and democracy. We haven't done that. That, I think, was, you know, a serious error in Kyrgyzstan. And now it's up to us to draw conclusions about it and try and straighten the situation up.
Congressman, your question is really central in terms of whether or not we can do both, and I believe we can do both on the basis of accumulated experience and looking at where we have been successful and where we haven't been successful. As Ambassador Abdrasayev mentioned in his opening remarks, having served the Kyrgyz government at the time the base was initially opened, it is in the Kyrgyz national security interest to have an American presence there. And the tide seems to have shifted in Central Asia, where in the 1990s, when the Americans first showed up in Central Asia, all of the states understood that there was a strategic value in having the United States present. Now that we're in the position of appearing to be blackmailed by a dictator, other dictators are looking at that and seeing possible opportunities. We have to shift back to the strategic questions while applying the lessons learned.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. So, Mr. Horton, at this juncture, is there any information that you're aware of that suggests that the Department of Defense purposely designed the fuel service contracts to enrich the first families?
It seems to me that the Department of Defense absolutely accepted that that might be the most expedient way to proceed.
You should have been diplomat.
That's the perception, the very broad perception inside Kyrgyzstan. We see that charge being made dramatically by the Chief of Staff, Adil Basalov, a number of other people. I frankly, looking at the details of how these contracts were structured, who was involved with them, I find it very difficult to refute that. I think it's likely that we're going to see the Defense Department say, well, in the end of the day, we got the fuel, we got it on time, and we got it for a reasonable price, so who cares? And the answer to that's got to be, you know, two governments fell in part because of this. So it really does make a big difference, and it really has disturbed our relationship with this country, which at one point was clearly the most pro-American country in Central Asia, and today may no longer be that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it begs the question, or the answer, I guess, that certainly they could have taken steps to steer those contracts away from the private interested companies and to another government type of entity or something a little more national in nature on that. How would that have looked?
I think they could have gone through a transparent public bidding process for the contracts. And they should have, what you would have seen probably was an effort by Kyrgyz authorities to rig the process so that only one company would be available as a possible provider or bidder. But I think the U.S. would have come out of this much better if it went through a public process and procurement, set it up for bids, and awarded it. In the end of the day, if it wound up going to a company that was controlled by the president, if that happened as a result of an open public process because that was the only company that was capable of fulfilling the contracts, we'd be a lot better off.
Well, I think we already have evidence that was not the case on that. But Ambassador, let me ask you, for a country the size of Kyrgyzstan, and now the $64 million lease number, I guess people banding around, what would that money have meant to Kyrgyzstan if it had not been dissipated into other corrupt parties or whatever? What would it do for a country like Kyrgyzstan to have the use of that money?
I think it's the discretion of the government, and probably if there would be a process of the open bidding, you know, they will see how through the taxes it will be distributed to different needs of the people, and they could explain it. But with the government of the Bakiyev, probably this was not the case. They were interested in different things. This tax, you mean not about additional to the oil? I think, again, through the budget, they could show that to use for the paying of the salaries and sustain some of the other projects. But my guess here that the base issue it's not the how to say the problem that now we have a bottleneck in Kyrgyzstan, and base is becoming just one of the few projects, and we need here more diversity. Still, the problem will continue further in the future, and we have to work on that issue as well.
Thank you. Dr. Husky, how does that number relate to the overall GDP of Kyrgyzstan?
I think it's something like 3%. I mean, this is it's not higher. It's a significant amount of money, and it clearly could have been put to very good use for the Kyrgyz people if this money had not been siphoned off. You know, it is a trick because even if you have open tender, even if you have a competitive bidding process, it is possible in a Bakiev-like environment for people surrounding the family after the fact to come in and horn their way into these legitimate businesses. This has happened one time after another in Kyrgyzstan and other parts of the post-communist world. But at least the original bidding should be competitive and above board.
Thank you. Mr. Dryhouse, care to ask any more questions?
I'd just like to ask one final question, if we could run through the panel. You know, clearly the United States has suffered a blow in terms of its legitimacy in Kyrgyzstan. And with respect to the long-term interests of the United States in the region and in the country, and I think we've discussed some of this, but just what are your one or two things that you believe we should be focusing on that would support the long-term interests, not just of Kyrgyzstan, but also of the United States, which I believe would also benefit us in the short term with regard to the base? Dr. Husky?
Well, I think something that hasn't been talked about is the role of Russia in this. Russia has been a very important player in bringing about the revolution, in trying to expel the United States in the first place. And so this is not just a U.S.-Kyrgyz issue. There is a triangular aspect to this. And so I think we have to frame it in that way. Russia is trying to expand its sphere of influence, understandably, after the difficult decades for them of the 1990s. And to what extent, you know, why it wanted to expel the United States, was that simply a sphere of influence issue? Was it trying to have a bargaining chip with the U.S. on other, perhaps larger issues of bilateral matters between the two countries? I'm not sure. But let me just stop there, and I'll let my colleagues add.
I think that the issue series about investments, which I already mentioned, quite an important one. And I planned at the beginning not to raise that issue, but probably it is a time. Kyrgyzstan from 1998 is the only country of the WTO in the region. And from that time, you know, during all of the 12 years, it's the only WTO member in the whole region, and China just joined in 2000. So you could imagine that 12 years ago, 200% of tariffs were erected, barrier against all our goods, and this is a factor which contributes to the poverty, unemployment, and desperation. So we need more investments. And the people, then they will be happy. That's it. And the Kazakhstan, sorry, by the way, who is teaching us about many things, they're also contributing to our poverty as well. Why? 200%. You know, I would like here to say, like President Reagan said in, you know, famous phrase, Mr. Nazarbayev, please tear that wall down. And then, you know, will be a miracle. Our people, they know how to handle it.
Thank you.
I think one lesson here is that we need to get out of this sort of competitive mindset that our competition with Russia, some type of, you know, great game, that zero sum for influence in Central Asia. I think this is potentially quite destructive because it also leads the Russians to behave in that kind of way, right, where they think any kind of blow that they can strike against our presence there is a gain for them. So I think part of it has to be recalibrating the mindset, being very clear as to what our goals are in Central Asia, right? Are they access to the base? That's not the same thing as undermining Russia, right? And working, I think, in a more consultative way with Moscow would behoove us. I see three-way competition in Central Asia between Russia, the U.S., and China. China did more trade with Central Asia in 2009 than Russia. And so in this relationship, Central Asia is not our backyard, right? Afghanistan's backyard. We need to have a distinct brand. What do we stand for that China doesn't stand for and that Russia doesn't stand for? And so this is why we get back to the importance of things like transparency and investment, engaging on a range of sort of social and democracy issues, things that the two other regional powers don't do. I think that will be part of our brand in Central Asia moving forward.
I think the path to our retention of our position with this base starts with our demonstration that this relationship is not just about the base, that it's more, that there's a broader foundation for it, that we care about democracy, we care about human rights, but especially that we care about education. That's, you know, when you press Kyrgyz, when they say you really don't care about anything in the base, and you press them, is that really true? Then frequently they'll sort of grudgingly say, oh, well, of course we recognize you did do all these things in the education sector. There's the American University that was set up. There was support for secondary education. There was English language training. There were scholarships. Frankly, the best invested money we put into Kyrgyzstan easily has been in the education sector, and it has been the basis for popular support in Kyrgyzstan for the broader security relationship. It's students from Kyrgyzstan who go to high schools in the U.S., who go to colleges, who get master's degrees, and those are the people who say, this isn't a bad idea, we need to sustain that relationship. We need to learn that lesson, and we need to continue that investment.
I would put forth that Kyrgyzstan is the only country in the region where there has been regime change since independence. You could argue that in Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi died and he was succeeded by his doctor, but it's essentially the same thing. There's now been 2 rounds of regime change in Kyrgyzstan, and the second round has been more violent than the first. So I think, you know, our strategic interest is in institutionalizing a way for regime change in a democratic, according to a democratic procedure in Central Asia that will serve as a model for the other countries, because this is the looming question for Uzbekistan, for Kazakhstan, for the other countries. How does succession happen? And I think Kyrgyzstan presents an excellent opportunity to look at better models for succession, and that could really be America's legacy in the region. As Dr. Cooley said, it's really a question of having the American brand be one of values, and that's what the people of Central Asia are looking towards.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fortenberry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today. I'm sorry I've missed the balance of your testimony, and I apologize if some of this is a bit repetitive, but I think, Mr. Ambassador, you may be best suited to answer this first question. Culturally speaking, what is the disposition of the people of Kyrgyzstan toward the United States as we look toward some of what was just discussed here, longer-term relationships, empowering governance capacities, particularly in terms of peaceful transfers of power and long-term stability in the country for the well-being of the people, but also clearly to secure interests that we have, such as our own base?
According to the poll which was made probably last year by the IRI, in Kyrgyzstan we have a quite negative trend towards the United States. Feelings are not good, and probably because of some of the promises which were not fulfilled. But and partly also this process was inflamed by the trends from the Russian Federation and the policies from the regime, which is now was changed. And in general, if we would again implement that suggestions which my colleague just made, education, grassroots level education, and support more to those forces which we have already there, civil society, NGOs, media, you know, they could start flourish, then we'll change it dramatically. And in parallel also, base would continue to exist. It's my, again, opinion that people, they could understand how to balance that together. And it's time for us just to be very, very proactive, and people of Kyrgyzstan would understand that clearly. I agree also with the opinion of my colleague from the Freedom House that it is a second change of regime in Kyrgyzstan. Unfortunately, we lost this time during 5 years in order to do that in orderly way. And now it is a time to show that how it is possible to do in Central Asia something which, by the way, happened quite successfully in Mongolia. Same thing, country, small size, but 5-6 times changes of regime, and now it's a full-fledged democracy, something where we have to look at the lessons and to work quite actively.
Mongolia, by the way, is a partner country with the House Democracy Partnership Commission, on which I serve, one of the early recipients of this opportunity to be in dialogue with us on an ongoing basis as to how we build their technical capacity in their parliament, their legislature. And so you're right, that's a good example in the region there. Does Russia actively connive at fomenting this anti-American spirit, or is it just part of the broader organic movement in the area at this point in time?
Russia now is trying to regain its influence in the region and in Kyrgyzstan as well, and we have to admit that Russia have a legitimate rights to be there in that territory, and pro-Russian sentiments are quite great. And I think that it's a time also for us to see how to work together with Russia. And if even Russia was involved in the change of the regime, probably it's also a sign that Russia have quite high stakes in promoting the regimes which are not so looking towards the feudalism like previous government of the Bakiyev tried to create. And I have plenty of examples which before Russia and US tried to implement in Central Asia to the benefits of the Kyrgyz Republic. So it's time also to find the common goals.
Well, somebody made the point that to convict the people that it's not necessary to pick a side here, but to actively engage in their own well-being by active engagement, constructive engagement with the United States, constructive engagement with Russia, is a potential outcome that is beneficial to them particularly, but would also help stabilize our relationship, I assume. Dr. Cooley, did you want to?
No, I would just also make the point that ever since the apparent double cross of Bakiyev against Putin last year, right, when Russia offered a $2 billion package of investments and assistance to close down the base closure was announced and then was walked back. Relations between Moscow and Bishkek really deteriorated to an all-time low, and Russia really launched an all-out soft power blitz in the media that really undermined the Bakiyev regime, calling him corrupt and nepotistic, drawing attention to these aspects of his rule. It was an onslaught, and it put us in an embarrassing position where, it was the Kremlin, for its very own cynical political purposes, that was drawing attention to these governance issues that we were relatively silent on. So Russia, through its soft power, through these cultural influences, also through the fact that Kyrgyz workers live and work in Russia and send home remittances, which comprise anywhere from 30 to 40% of Kyrgyz GDP. For all these reasons, Kyrgyzstan's connections with Russia are quite close, and we need to take that into account.
There's a certain irony in what you just said, though. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fortenberry. Let me thank all of the witnesses for giving up your time today and sharing your expertise. You can't get rid of us very easily, so I'm hoping that you'll all assent to us being able to call on you at some point in the future if we want to take advantage of your knowledge and your understanding and your expertise. So I'll take those little nods of your head as assent to that, and I appreciate it. I mean, you've been a tremendous help to us in setting the table for what I think are going to be some pretty extensive hearings and in depth, and I think you've let us have some context to where we ought to go on that. So I want to thank all of you. Ambassador, thank you, especially for your difficult times that you're experiencing, and it's our hope that this investigation does serve the purpose of lending some transparency and accountability to the situation that's gone for everybody involved, for the United States and for people in Kyrgyzstan, in that we just find out what happened and who the players were and what they did, and We can then determine whether it was good, bad, or indifferent and act accordingly from there to make sure that we build a stronger relationship and take a good path forward. I do want to just say that I note one thing that's a common thread on this is that, you know, we can't always have just a military priority solely and lead with the military, put that as our foremost priority, treat it as if it's the only one or whatever. We've got to have a more whole-of-government approach, as somebody mentioned earlier on this, and reach out diplomatically as well. Rule of law issues, democracy, all of those things are important. And in that context, I think that we may get more cooperation out of friends and allies if we show a deeper interest and a longer-range interest in their well-being. And then that should encompass some of our mutual priorities as well. So thank you all for being here and for all that you've done for this committee. We appreciate it. Thank the members of the panel as well. Meeting adjourned.